was Sunday afternoon, and here I was, lying on the couch as I enjoyed another lazy weekend. I was on vacation from work, so that meant that every day was lazy day. I was single and I was also living alone. I didn't much care about housework, and other than lying on my couch or in my bed, the other thing I did was to hang out with my friends. But something this afternoon seemed amiss, as if poised to change my routine. Amidst a huge pack of snacks and after several clicks of the remote, looking for a TV program that could entertain me, I heard the doorbell ring. Painstakingly, I got up from the sofa, walked slowly to the door, spotted a visitor through the tiny magic eye, and only then said something. It was my neighbor and friend, Bob. Bob seemed to be in a hurry, and wanted me to do something he needed help with. He'd asked me to watch over his house while he was away. Bob said he had personal matters to tend to and was going to be away for a few days. As a good friend of his, I didn't think twice about it, and agreed to do that favor for him. He thanked me and handed over a copy of the house key, so that I could go into his yard and feed the dogs once per day. Bob said goodbye to me, got into his car, and drove off at an alarmingly fast speed. I found my friend's behavior strange. Bob was always in a good mood, but he was tense when he left, and he had a worried look on his face. I suspected that something could be wrong, but I didn't have enough time to question Bob about that. His strange and unexpected visit had lasted little more than a minute, after all. In the coming days, I did as Bob had asked of me. I went to his property to feed the dogs every day, always making sure to also check that his house was safe. But one of those days, something caught my attention. The atmosphere in his house seemed different. I felt a huge discomfort when I stepped into his backyard to feed his dogs, which was a feeling I'd never noticed the other times I was there. I didn't know what it was, but I felt uncomfortable. Yet, even after that day, I always headed to his house to feed his canine companions. One night, before going to bed, I did as I'd done the previous nights. From my bedroom window, I took one last look over Bob's house to make sure everything was in order, but this time I was startled by something. I saw what appeared to be a person looking out the living room window. Confused, I continued to stare at the strange figure, which a few seconds later disappeared. I continued to watch over, but I was beginning to doubt if I'd really seen something. After all, there wasn't supposed to be anyone in the house. That is, until something else spooked me again. This time, I was sure that it wasn't just my imagination playing tricks on me. But it wasn't the same shadow I'd seen before that now seemed to be there, haunting me. It was the lights in Bob's house, which were repeatedly turning on and off. Living room, kitchen, bedrooms, every hour it was a different room, which confused me even more. All this going on and off didn't last long, and soon the house was dark again. I picked up my phone and tried to call Bob, but his number appeared to be out of range. I then called his house's landline, not knowing if it would work or not. Bob's house phone rang, once, twice, 3, 4 times, and only after the 5th ring did someone answer. But whoever was there and answered the phone didn't say anything. I could hear only my heavy breathing. Seconds later, the call was dropped. I went back to watching Bob's house. I was scared, but I wanted to know what was going on. A few minutes later, that same shape appeared again in the living room window, but now I was sure that it was a person. A woman, to be more precise. That strange woman seemed to know that I was looking at her because, with her hands, she gestured and made movements, as if she was calling out to me. Even though I was astonished, I couldn't stop staring at the strange lady until she stopped waving her hands. And seemingly, in a fit of rage, she started screaming, and slamming her hands violently against the window. I was so terrified, that I tripped and fell backward over the floor. Still splayed on it, I kept hearing screams and sounds the woman was making as she kept pounding against the window. My God, what is happening? I thought. A short time later, the noises ceased, and the night fell silent again. I continued to lie on the floor, not having the courage to get up and look in the direction of Bob's house again. But the worst fright was yet to come. I began to hear sounds in the living room of my own house, then footsteps on the stairs leading up to my bedroom, exactly where I was. Terrified, I shrank in a corner of my room, and listened to the sounds of footsteps getting closer and closer, until a woman appeared in the doorway, and it was the same woman I'd seen in the living room window of Bob's house. She was naked, crying a lot, and had many bruises all over her body. As I saw that terrifyingly looking woman approaching me, I became desperate, and fainted. When I came back to it, the sun was already shining through the windows. Still confused and frightened by what I'd witnessed last night, I got up, and went to my bedroom window, and from there I could see the street full of people, and with lots of police and fire trucks in front of Bob's house. I felt even more confused. News broadcasted that the police, through a report from a neighbor who heard desperate cries of a woman, had found bodies of 3 women in the back of Bob's house. He had cruelly murdered all 3 of them. Bob was arrested a few days later in another town, where he confessed the murders. I was surprised by Bob's cruelty, for I'd never expected that from someone who had always been a good friend of mine. That day, after waking up from my moment of fright and seeing all the commotion in the street, I also noticed something that was not only on the wall of my room, but also in the other rooms of my house. It was a single sentence, written in blood. "Help me." My name is Jose, and everything began on February 17, 1988, when I was walking back from Mass as usual. The way from my house to the church is considered very dangerous by most people. That is because I live on a farm located near a mountain range, and the only way to get somewhere is to cross the road, which by the way has no sidewalks. So, I and the other Catholics always walked in total darkness, when there were no cars passing by, for about 40 minutes, in order to get to our beloved church. On this day I had left home late, and the road was completely dark and lonely, and everyone had already gone to Mass. I was walking in the darkness, when I saw a small altar with a lighted candle in the middle of the woods. That sort of thing is very common around here, so I didn't mind it. I happened to see something moving inside the altar, and when I looked, it was a woman wearing a pink dress, with black hair, and she was moving her head from side to side non-stop like crazy. I hurried my steps, and didn't look back. During Mass I kept thinking about the woman. Who was she? Had I seen a ghost? But I noticed that no one had mentioned the incident, and here, when something out of the ordinary happens, it spreads and everyone knows about it. I played my role of a good Christian, appearing to be in tune with what the priest was saying, and at 10 p.m. I returned home by the same route, but this time with all the other people. When I arrived near the place where I had seen the altar, I noticed that it was there, but there was no sign of any woman. I thought about telling someone about it, but remembered how ignorant people here were, and that they would call me crazy, so I kept my doubts to myself. The next day, I woke up at 4:30 in the morning as usual, and before eating something and starting work, I made up an excuse that I needed to buy some milk and left. Of course, my intention was to pass near the altar, and off I went. This time I was able to get very close, and saw that inside there were 2 red candles, a basket with some rotten fruit, and a handful of hair stuck on a nail that was inside the altar. Never before a handful of hair had caused me such fear and apprehension. I stood there for a while, thinking about it, when I saw a woman coming out of a bush, and I knew that she was the owner of the clump of hair. She was completely battered, and at the time I felt some relief, because not only did I confirm that she wasn't a ghost, but I also confirmed that she was just another drunk like so many women in the area. She looked at me and smiled, showing me a mouth with missing teeth. I smelled something very strange, like the stench of urine or the piss of a dog. I hurried to leave, when she grasped my arm with unusual strength and spoke. "You saw me yesterday, didn't you? Then get ready because you're next." "Next for what?" I asked angrily. "Just next." And having told me this, she turned around and vomited a liquid so red I swore it was blood. I got out of there as fast as I could, leaving the clump of hair there. I hurried back home without buying the milk, the memory of that woman making me feel paranoid. I told myself not to worry, after all the people in this region are all a bit crazy due to the isolation and poverty we faced, but there was still something wrong about all that. After a hard day's work on a nearby farm, I came home and lit some candles, since there is no electricity here. I remember heating up some coffee and drinking it without tasting it, while the woman's vomit kept playing in my head. Suddenly, I heard a noise coming from outside, as if someone was running through the bushes. I went into the bedroom, got my shotgun and a candle, and opened the window. I looked around, but I couldn't see anything. It wasn't even windy, and that's when I felt a very strong sting in my canine tooth. I gave a loud scream of pain, and fell to the ground, writhing. It felt like my tooth was being pulled, and the more I struggled the pain only increased. I tasted a strong rush of blood, and ran to the bathroom, which was completely dark. I rinsed my mouth out in the sink, and ran to get another candle, and when I looked in the mirror I saw something unimaginable behind me. First I was startled by my own image in the mirror, as dark, almost black blood dripped from my mouth, and trickled down to the floor as my teeth throbbed, and that's when I noticed something dark behind me. It was a black, hairy being with red eyes like a cat's in the dark, but they were big eyes with no pupils, and it had a very large horn that went around like a snail, and all my awareness of what was happening lasted less than 2 seconds, before I turned and ran out of the bathroom, and out of my house like a madman. I ran desperately through the dark bushes without seeing anything, trying to get to the nearest house, which was Johnny's, but during my frantic run I looked ahead trying to see something, and I ran into the creature from the bathroom. I felt the texture of those black hairs against my body, and I smelled the same animal smell that I smelled coming from the woman. His body was hard as a rock, and I fell face first onto the floor, and could see that his feet looked like kangaroo's feet. I didn't know what to do anymore, and I was screaming as loud as I could, when I felt myself being lifted by the hair, and that demon looked me straight in the eye. I can't explain how I felt. All I know is that for a few seconds I began to feel familiar with him, and that's when my neck was bitten without hesitation by the creature. I started to ask for forgiveness for my sins, for I was sure that I was going to die, and I felt the flesh being torn from my neck as blood gushed out, and the creature made a sound like a crying baby. Suddenly I heard a snap, and woke up in Johnny's house. He told me that he heard my screams, picked up his rifle, and saw the creature biting me, and then he shot it countless times mercilessly. I fainted, and when the creature fell, it turned into a woman, while a black liquid overflowed from every orifice in that lifeless body. He took me to his home, and bandaged me precariously, as we had no access to any means of communication, and the nearest hospital was too far away. The next day, when I regained consciousness, I felt better, and when I went to take a shower and looked in the mirror, I had the impression that my canines were slightly larger, and a red gleam flashed through my eyes. My story ends here, and according to Johnny, when he returned to the place where the woman's body lay, there was nothing there but the black liquid that had penetrated the earth like oil. A few years ago, my mother, my grandmother, my uncle, and a friend were in Ashcombe, a town in the interior of Illinois, on a trip. On the day they were leaving, my uncle, who was the driver, went through a very disturbing experience, and did not feel up to driving. My mother and her friend knew about it, but my grandmother did not, so they spared her from knowing about it, so as not to worry her, and thus they ended up postponing the trip. So, Mom decided to drive instead of my uncle, and my grandmother made up some excuse as to why she had changed drivers. Well, since Ashcombe is more or less 4 or 6 hours from Chicago, they decided to leave around dawn to arrive in town in the morning. However, at that time, and in fact I think even nowadays, the roads don't have any kind of illumination, except for the moon and the stars, which to some extent are not much. Anyway, they left at that time. They traveled for an hour or so until they spotted a parked car, and the driver was outside waving his hand for them to stop. Since in those days the risks of a robbery or kidnapping on the roads were practically non-existent, they stopped the car and checked what the man wanted. The driver of the stranded vehicle was there with his wife and small daughter. The gas in their car had run out, and he was borrowing some. Not caring to give some, Mom turned off the car, and the others got off, and stood outside while the gasoline was pumped from one car to the other. While this was going on, they ended up talking and getting to know each other. And so, even after some of the gas was gifted, they turned on the headlights of the car and talked some more. And that's when something sinister started to happen. While they were talking, a girl, in her white robes, not the typical ghostly dress, just normal white robes, walked past them with her head down, and without saying a word, seemingly going on her merry way. Everyone who was talking froze immediately and spotted the woman disappearing into the darkness of dawn. They didn't understand anything, and before long, already frightened, they each got into their own cars. The driver of the other car thanked them for the gas and went on his way, just as Mom did. But it had only been 5 minutes since the girl had passed them, and those 5 minutes were enough for her to totally disappear on that road. After about 2 hours, when they no longer expected to find her, to their surprise, they spotted the girl, still walking alone on the dark road. My mother, not happy that she was walking there just like that, decided to ask where she was going, and if she needed a ride. Everyone was against her doing this, but since she was very curious and had always been the wild one of the family, decided to follow the girl until she pulled up next to her, and called her the girl with long black hair, covering her back, stopped and slowly walked to the car. When she leaned against the window and raised her head, it was enough for everyone inside the car, except Mom, not to dare to say anything else. The woman, who had the body of a girl of about 23 to 25, had the face of an old woman of 80 or so. While everyone froze, she looked at Mom and asked quietly, "Yes?" Mom then plucked up enough courage and asked where she was going. The woman said she was going to Chicago, just like them. Mom then took the plunge and asked if she wanted a ride. By this time, everyone in the car objected to taking her. They were completely terrified. But Mom said that this was rude, and that she would give her a ride. The problem was that all the seats but one in the back were occupied, and those in the back refused to sit there with her. So Mom made a deal. My uncle, still unlike his normal self, risked driving, and Mom switched places with her friend who was in the passenger seat, making him move to the back seat, and shared the passenger seat with his wife, who accepted the ride. After this, they drove off. After the woman got into the car, no one, apart from Mom, dared to say anything. It was as if they were so terrified that they were almost in a state of trance. Then, seeing that they wouldn't say anything, Mom started a conversation with the woman. They started to talk about whatever would take away the fear of the others, but as time went on, Mom, who was sandwiched by the other passengers, found it strange that she couldn't feel the woman's body touching hers. It was as if she wasn't there. The window was open, and the wind that blew did not move a hair of her, who always kept her head down, and her hair covering a good part of her face. So, Mom asked, "Miss Madam, what were you doing out there? Why were you alone?" Then the woman answered, "I was on an outing with 4 other friends, but the car overturned, and they all died at this moment." Even Mom could not deny the shivering. Then she evaluated the whole situation, everything that had already happened, and after rethinking several times, she mustered up some courage and asked, "Excuse me, but have you died already?" It was then that my grandmother finally piped up. "Honey, what kind of question is that?" asked my grandmother nervously. My mother didn't answer right away, but the guest, however, slowly turned her face towards my mother, and with a bit of hair still on her face, she asked, "Do you not think it's appropriate?" Mom then piped up, speaking directly to the guest. "Look, you were walking alone in the middle of the night, on foot, and on a completely dark road. You have a girl's body and an old woman's face. You said you were with your friends in a car, that it had flipped over and that they all died. Well, I think that you died as well." The woman didn't try to argue. Mom didn't understand her reaction, but she understood her silence as a confirmation of her suspicions. Finally, after those words, neither the woman nor anyone else spoke during the rest of the trip. When they finally arrived in Chicago, the woman told them where they could drop her off. When they got to her address, which by the way was on a corner of a typical street, she got off, thanked them for the ride, and walked until she disappeared into the next block. Mom told me that after she disappeared, it began to rain completely out of the blue, as if a single heavy cloud was hovering overhead. Then, after she got out of the car, it seemed that everyone had woken up from their trance, and headed to a friend's house, where they were going to drop him off. But as they turned the next block, the rain stopped the same way it had started, completely out of nowhere, only leaving everyone even more terrified. When they finally arrived at our friend's house, he didn't let them leave until he was able to get inside. He was so desperate that he almost didn't get out of the car and could hardly find the key. He needed my uncle's help to guide him to the door and get him there safely inside. After that, they said goodbye and Mom, Grandma, and Uncle went back home. Mom was also scolded for giving the woman a ride, but she just ignored it. A few days later, still puzzled by the contents of that trip, we drove down the street where we had dropped that woman off. To everyone's astonishment, we found out that the street was behind a cemetery. Fear overtook our minds, and we promised never to pick up another hitchhiker ever again.